Okay, so I want to start this community call, and first of all, I'd like to introduce myself because most probably you don't know me, and the reason for that is that I'm since February this year with 23 technologies, and I just got started with Kubernetes, Gardener extensions, all of that stuff. So yeah, that's the reason why you most probably don't know me. Before that, I was at RWTH Aachen University at the Institut für Nachrichtentechnik, and I did a PhD studies in video coding there. So this is totally a different field. So I'm kind of new. And this is also kind of bringing me to the motivation of this call, because when I started with Gardener and Gardener extension development, this was very challenging for me because I was kind of, yeah, well, checking what is available in different Git repositories, what is coming from other sources, what is given in the documentation, and so on and so forth. And well, yeah, I kind of had a hard time, but I found my way somehow through. And I had the impression that maybe something like a minimal working example would be a good idea to have in order to get people like me up and running more quickly. And for this reason, I developed such an example and wrote a blog post about that. And you will find that blog post on our website. I will show it in a second. And I think we could also just put some links in the video descriptions after publishing that video. So now I want to go ahead and start screen sharing. And now you should see Firefox. And now you should see the blog post. And basically, this is where you find it on just 23technologies.cloud. And then you go to blog and check out for getting started with Gardener extension development. And this blog post is more or less corresponding to the minimal working example Git repository in our GitHub namespace, 23 technologies, Gardener extensions, MWE for minimal working example. And yeah, well, you will find all the resources and only a very limited number of commits, which are also referenced in the blog post. So you should also treat this call as kind of an introduction for newbies and newcomers, and for future newcomers who will watch the video afterwards, and not as an expert talk, because, well, of course, in this call here, there are people with way more expertise than I have, as I already said. And yeah, maybe you can learn something, maybe you cannot, but well, for me at least, it would not be the first time that I learned something from a beginner's tutorial. So first of all, I want to just go quickly through this block diagram, because this is something which would have helped me with starting. Because when I start developing something, I always want to start on my local machine and want to try to, well, explore what code is doing and how I can attach a debugger to it and so on and so forth. And this was kind of hard to figure out in the first place in the Gardener context, because I felt like I need a whole Gardener in order to start developing. And because I figured out that this is the basic architecture, so that I have a development computer, I have my tool chain here, I have some kube configs, I have some piece of code, and I have a garden cluster, seed clusters, or one seed cluster. And I have to somehow interact with this whole Gardener setup. And I wasn't really aware that, for example, one can fake a Gardener environment, and I will show that in a second, just for the newcomers and the newbies. And that would have helped me a lot when getting started. And then let's switch to the directory structure of the minimal working example. So basically, this example directory, which we can find in almost every extension, is kind of, well, I think there's a whole lot of truth in there. And I found out that these resources, which are not coming from us, they are just copied over from other extensions. Fake shoot control plane, CRD for cluster, CRD for extension, and so on and so forth, are basically setting up a gardener environment, or kind of a gardener environment in a vanilla Kubernetes cluster. And with that piece of information and the overall directory structure given in that minimal working example, one can just go ahead and start trying out to run the code in this extension and to explore what it is doing by debugging, for example. So the important part for the controller lives in package controller lifecycle here in this minimal working example, and basically actuator.go is the most interesting file. And as you can see, it will do basically nothing. It will just say, okay, hello world, I just entered the reconcile method if the reconcile method is called, and then it will return nil. So same holds true for the delete. It will just tell us that it's deleted the extension resource, that it was deleted. And I just want to show in a short demo how I approached the interaction with this controller, so that others, newcomers, can follow this. Basically, I already cloned the repository, so we are in gardener-extension-shoot-flux here. And what I want to do first, I want to create a client cluster so that I have a Kubernetes cluster available we can work with in the next minutes. And afterwards, I want to just make clear that I'm more or less following all the steps reported in the blog post. Well, there are slight differences, but this is not really important. You can figure this out on your own if you want to do it on your own. So the kind cluster is ready already. So I create a directory called dev, and I want to put the kubeconfig of the Kubernetes cluster into dev kubeconfig.yaml. Well, we switched to an English keyboard, now it should work. kubeconfig.yaml. And if I can type, now it's okay. So now we should have the kubeconfig in dev kubeconfig.yaml. And if I export that one and apply the resources of the in the example directory, then I can already start the controller. So what I do is I simply export the kubeconfig equals dev kubeconfig.yaml, and now I have that prepared already. So I will just copy it from another editor to here. I apply simply the resources up to the cluster resource, which are provided in the example directory. And these should get created now. So now they are created, and I can, of course, watch the cluster using K9S. And let's see whether we have a custom resource definition. There's the cluster definition, and it's 15 seconds old. So everything seems to be fine. And what I can do now, I can already run the controller in this directory. I also prepared the command already. Simply go run /command gardener-extension-shoot-flux and so on and so forth. This was quite fast now because I compiled it already. So if you do that the first time, most probably it will take another second because the code needs to be compiled. And now this controller is running against the kubeconfig. I just put in dev kubeconfig.yaml, so it should also react on resources which I can apply in that cluster. So now let's try and trigger the reconcile method by creating an extension resource, because this controller in the minimal working example is basically listening, so to say, for the extension resources. The reason for that is that I was looking for a very basic example, and this is basically coming from the from another extension, from the shoot networking filter extension, where also extension resources are reconciled. So then let's go ahead, split the window. Okay, I cannot see anything. No, maybe. Let's go there. And I don't know whether I need to export the cube config once again. Okay, and now I should be able to apply the extension resource, which also lives in the example directory. And what we can see on the left-hand side is that actually our controller was triggered. So what we see is the hello world message, hello world, I just entered the reconcile method. So that was kind of a very good starting point for me, so that I was able to interact with the controller, which should also work in the end in the gardener context in a real world gardener and not in this vanilla Kubernetes cluster with some custom resource definitions and so on. So I can also delete the extension resource, of course. Let's do that, and then we should see the other message I already showed you. I think I have some problem with the pasting here, but it should be okay. So now the MWE was deleted, and we also see that we have the message over here, successfully deleted the extension, and our controller seems to be working fine. Now, of course, now we can do something like printf debugging if we like. So we could simply put some code into the reconcile method and execute it like I did already, and then you can, yeah, well, just print some variables if you like, and you can see what is in there. However, I do not really like this approach of debugging, so to say, and the reason for that is that it's kind of limited. You always need to, yeah, well, put another print statement for every single variable you want to watch. So for that reason, I want to show quickly how we can also attach a debugger, elf for Go, to that process. So let's quit the controller once again and run it in debug mode. So this is basically the same command, but just running in DLV for Delph with debug. And let's put a breakpoint. Let's put a breakpoint in the reconcile method. And we do that with B in Delph. And now we have a breakpoint in actuator.go in line 31. And if we continue now, we should stop exactly over there when we apply once more. Do I have it? Simply do it like this. Extension is 40. So, and now I triggered the controller once again, and we stopped in the debugger, and now we can see that we are actually standing in line 31. So this is the reconcile method, and you also see what will be executed next. Hello world, I just entered the reconcile method. And of course, we are also able to do some debugging here. For example, we can, first of all, let's just list all commands that Delph will provide us. And what we can do, for example, is we can, of course, we can continue, we can step. Here we can step through the program. We could put other breakpoints. We could, for example, also print variables, of course. So let's go ahead and print the extension variable so that we can watch what is in there. Well, first of all, let's see. It should be, yeah, simply ex. So we can print the extension variable and see what is already stored in this variable. And what we also see is that type meta is not that interesting, but for example, object meta, we can simply list that one a little bit more, well, let's say, better aligned, so that is, yeah, that there's a little bit more space, and we can see that there's a namespace in there. There's some self-link field, and so on and so forth. So I think most of you know how to operate a debugger, but for me that really helped a lot in getting into all this kind of resources. So now we can see easily what we can expect from a from the object meta of an extension resource, for example, and that we can, for example, find out in which namespace this one lives. So that really helped me approaching this overall topic of extension development and just fiddling around and finding out where to go and which knobs to tune and so on and so forth. Of course, for a real world gardener setup, there's something more to be done. For this, a gardener needs to be running somewhere. One could start with a local setup, which is explained in the documentation, or one could also start with setup with known setup for gardener. However, I don't want to go through that now in detail because I think it's not really helping in that context. If you want to learn more, or well, if you are really a newcomer, then you could also contact me and I can show you how that works. But it's also documented in the blog post. So basically, you could also just follow the steps under development in a real world gardener environment and check what is different, and everything should be explained in detail. And well, if you're missing something, of course, you can simply reach out and I'm always willing to improve my work, and we are always willing to improve our work. So if there's something missing, of course, we are willing to extend it or to add something, and there is no need. Well, there's of course no claim to be for this blog post to be perfect. Well, this minimal working example then in the end led to another extension, and this is the extension we call shoot-flux, so gardener-extension-shoot-flux. And now I want to hand over to Lothar because he wants to show what this extension can do for you if you want to use it, and how Flux can be used for a more or less universal approach to shoot configuration with that extension. I think we can put all the questions and discussion in the end of this call. And first of all, let's listen to Lothar.
Okay, thank you. Share my screen. That work? Yes. Okay. About the shoot-flux extension, the basic motivation or our thinking was now that Jens was proficient in the basics of gardener extension development. We wanted to do something useful for the real world, but without getting into all of the details of extensions. So we wanted something simple, but at the same time, we had this idea where I thought this could be really powerful as well. So this is the extension that Jens developed next. So all of the code and props goes to him. I'm just showing this because I basically asked him to write it and have a lot of knowledge about Flux. So what this extension basically does, and it's really not too complicated, is install Flux into shoot clusters. So that doesn't sound very exciting, but I think it's a very powerful method. And to understand what you can achieve with this, I have to explain a bit about Flux. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically Flux, which you can find the documentation here, is a Kubernetes controller that mainly reads from a Git repository and applies stuff it finds in the Git repository to the target cluster on a very basic level. So the one controller that does this is the customization controller. Customization is a standard Kubernetes thing to collect and patch and modify YAML files. But at a very basic level, you can just think of that of applying all YAML files it finds in some folder. So if you look at this example from the documentation, this basically instructs Flux to read from this Git repository in the master branch and then apply everything it finds, or the customization it finds in the customize folder to the target cluster it's configured for. The next thing, the other thing it also has is a Helm controller, which basically does the same thing. You can instruct it to read from, for example, a Helm repository and then apply the Helm chart. It finds there with a set of values you provided. And I'm going to show that for our own example. So, but back to the extension. The extension is written in a way that it is active for an entire Gardener project, or it is configured on a Gardener project level. So there's an operator that configures the extension by deploying a config map to one of the Gardener projects. So for in the virtual Gardener space where the shoots exist, he creates a config map, and the Flux controller reads that config map. I'm going to show that in a minute. And the other thing the extension does is create an SSH key that is just for read access to the Git repository. So you then fetch the SSH key and can add it to the Git repository as a deploy key, for example. And then the extension not only installs Flux, but also configures Flux to read from the Git repository. So that is a very high level. And now with the example, I think that's a little more concrete. And please just read the entire blog post for more information. It's a long text, so I'm certainly not going to be in the same detail as that. So this is the config map. I already applied this to the cluster just to save some time. But again, this just instructs or configures the Flux in the end to read from my demo repository. And it also tells it that it's a private repository, so the SSH key stuff is properly configured. So basically, I would apply this config map. This is an environment where I have my a service account for Gardener. It's already there. And so now I'm in K9S showing you my namespace, and there's a secret Flux source where, you know, there's an SSH key, which I now have to invalidate. Okay, so this is the virtual Gardener stuff. So I have shoots set up here. One of them, just for demo God's reason, I already configured, but one of them we are going to configure now together and watch things happening. So I'm going to do this in the Gardener dashboard just for convenience. So the demo one shoot is already created and just a very standard, nothing special about it. I'm going to add the extension of type shoot-flux to this shoot. You could also enable the extension globally, so that it's active by default for each shoot cluster, but we didn't want that for this installation. Okay, so the demo one cluster is now reconciling, and we are going to switch back and watch things happening. This is the demo one. As I said, a completely empty standard shoot cluster. And in a minute, the Flux components are installed. And after they are installed, they themselves connect to Git and install more stuff. So the controllers are starting, and now there's a chain of things that needs to happen. But if I create a new shoot in the same project and add this extension, it will get the same configuration. So this is what we think is the powerful stuff. You can you have an universal method to deploy stuff to shoots without having to write explicit extensions for each of them. Okay, so there's some delay because the configuration is deployed after the installation, so it needs a minute, but it should be there soon. And yeah, it's still reconciling. I'm going to wait for this for a bit. So or maybe I'm going to show the order of stuff. Okay, so the next thing is happening. This is the Nginx controller. I'm bringing my own Nginx controller, and I'm not using the Gardener add-on. This is just to show a bit of Flux methods. And after the Nginx controller was installed and is successful. There's a pod info, pod deployed, which is just a normal deployment or like an echo server deployment where just something is happening. Okay, there we see the pods. I'm not sure why they are terminating, but now they're starting. This probably has to do with Helm having a failed attempt and now having a successful attempt. And now I also in this, as part of this pod info deployment, which I'm going to show you the YAML files, we also get an ingress. And I'm using the Gardener components for DNS and certificates. So in a minute, when the address shows up, or I can use the describe controller. So there we also already see the certificate is ready. And in just a minute, I'm going to see that DNS is ready. And then I can open this page in my browser. And as you can see, this is using the shoot domain. So this is all, completely, you can imagine this could be anything. Okay, so if I open this now, I get a page for my new deployment, and it pings all of the pods it knows and changes around which it's connected to. So this could be now any web service or really anything. Now I'm going to show a bit of the structure in the Git repository, just a few pointers or tricks. This is all normal Flux stuff. This is not too specific to Gardener. So there's a small trick in there. The first thing I deploy is basically, or that Flux deploys, is basically this file, which splits up into two customizations. And this is just for ordering stuff. So I want to deploy the pod info only after Nginx was deployed. This is just so, we avoid some certain errors or some timeouts, certainly not technically necessary. The Nginx part of things, again, just to demonstrate, uses a Helm repository pointing to the upstream Nginx, and then has a Helm release, so-called. So this is the Flux wording. Installs this Helm chart to the kube system namespace, and you could provide it with lots of values here if you need something special. And then afterwards, the pod info is deployed. And the pod info is, again, a Helm repository. This is, from the upstream or the Flux development uses this example. And again, installs a Helm release. And the only thing I'm doing here is to add this. I'm adding values from our config map. And there a little bit of trickery begins. This config map is basically a template. I'm just adding a bit of stuff, and I'm able to use certain variables here, which, for example, inserts the shoot domain here, or there are more of that. I can show them all of the available variables in a minute, which is just from a config map that Gardener creates anyway. And this is, I jumped over this is here. So this is also a Flux mechanism to substitute variables from a config map. And if you wonder why this is might seem a bit complicated, since this config map lives in the kube system namespace, I had to have a customization that also lives in this namespace. So this is just some Flux switching around. But this basically replaces variables with values it finds in this shoot info config map. And maybe because that's interesting, I'm going to show all of them, maybe like this. So I could not only use the domain, but I also have access to the Kubernetes version. Maybe for some, I need to do things differently. Just the project name, where I'm running, and again, the shoot name. If I, for example, want to, I could, for example, instruct Flux to read from a folder that's called demo1 and just apply stuff it finds in that folder. So I could even have shoot specific deployments or do some other logic there to find out more. Okay. yeah, that's basically the demo done. Again, I think the point is that a dedicated pod info extension that just deploys this pod info thing in a very specific way, or if you replace pod info with, for example, a logging framework or some monitoring stuff you want to do, or security stuff, that would be probably much harder to write than just a Flux extension. And this extension is universal, so it allows you to do whatever you want for an entire project of shoots. And certainly we could find or do more work that where you could be more specific what shoot does what. This is a really basic first attempt at this extension. And if you also enable it globally for all shoots in all projects, for example, you could even have a deployment where the gardener operator has some more control of how shoots look like, and have some, could deploy his, for example, security stuff. The way we deploy Flux is not meant, of course, or it would allow the owner of the shoot to, for example, disable Flux or override stuff in the shoot. So it's not meant for things where you expect the shoot owner to work against you. So maybe for core security mechanisms, you couldn't or wouldn't use it like this. But if you see yourself as a service-oriented Kubernetes, managed Kubernetes place, and you want to offer more services to your users in their shoots, this is certainly something you could do with that. Okay, so that's the demo. I think now we could switch to questions, and not only about Flux and this extension, of course, but also about general gardener extensions. And I think, I think this for us, for our company, we also developed the Hetzner Cloud provider extension a while ago. This really was meant as a point to show or for ourselves to explore what else extensions can do, and where we want to see the extension ecosystem evolve around Gardener. And I think extensions are a really powerful way to extend Gardener, and I think a bit underappreciated or underused. I would expect or I would hope for like hundreds of extensions to exist, and not only the core provider extensions and the stuff that the core team provides, but I think there's a lot of things to explore and to manage or to add value to Gardener via extensions. So we really hope not to do it on our own, but also find other nice extensions out there and use them and collaborate on extensions in general. Okay, so feel free to ask questions.
I saw Vasu raising his hand a couple of times.
No, I was clapping. Hello, Lothar and Jens. Thank you very much. This was really interesting. I was just grappling with one question I had when you created the Flux extension. You made it react onto a config map. Why didn't you choose an own CRD? That
maybe Jens could speak to that.
Yeah, well, actually, that was also something I considered. However, well, it was just the first go-to solution to have this config map. The idea was to make it possible to configure on the project level, so let the garden operator configure some Git repository for all shoots rolled out in that project, and that was quite easily performed with the config map. Of course, there are other ways to do it.
Oh, of course. No, I was just wondering why. No, but it's okay. This is a first attempt, but it probably the config map just it does all what you need. You probably don't need to create a CR. I was just wondering whether you contemplated on that. But okay, yeah, no, very nice. I especially also like the way how you introduced the minimal working extension, and yeah, and it's I'm really grateful and thank you in the name of the Gardener project for putting effort into the documentation. And I hear that you're already in working together with our documentation folks.
Yes, and well, I can also comment once more on that. Well, there's also no claim for the blog post to be exclusively on our webpage. So if you want to repost them, if you want to just copy them over wherever you want, if you just want to copy some code snippets, just go ahead and do it. There is no well, there's no copyright.
Creative Commons.
Yes.
I think our Gardener homepage has the ability to link into the content of yours. Yeah. And while I see, at least in my Zoom meeting, I see Nikki, these colleagues, Nikki Dukowski, they also created a lot of additional add-ons. Just want to call you out, Nikki. Would that be a way how you create extensions for all that Elastic stuff, which you use and the observability stuff?
Yes, of course. It's it makes total sense to go in that direction as well. Yeah. We have our own Flux-based machinery basically invented to fill in all these extensions, but they can be much more naturally integrated within the shoot YAML. And definitely this is a good direction to go, in my opinion. Our Flux subsystem is actually reacting on Git repository. So we are defining our cluster states and provision them in Git repos. And then, yeah, I mean, the usual Flux machinery kicks in and deploys all these things. But yeah, definitely, Vaso. Makes sense.
I'm just observing that, interestingly, many of these types of requirements are reinvented all over our large company, but also outside. And then here comes the folks from 23T and just show us, hey, this is how you actually can bring together people using a common layer. Nice.
Yeah. Well, true. Okay, I mean, as Casey was referring, I mean, Kubernetes is a platform building platforms, and now we have a pretty good machinery to do so.
Very nice. Okay, I want to hand it over to other colleagues for comments as well.
Yeah, maybe Christoph speaking. I have one question. Wouldn't it maybe even make sense to get one step further and deploy the Flux into the seed, into the control plane, and not into the shoot? I mean, watching the shoot, of course, no? Controlling the shoot?
Yeah, certainly. This is totally possible. And we evaluated this for a few minutes, but decided to go with the, like the naive approach first. But I agree this would be even nicer, but has implications about security and resource sharing, where this is just a topic we avoid by each shoot having its own Flux controller, which is also, it allows the shoot owner to bring his own Git repository resources, his own customization resources, and just have the Flux installed and managed for him.
Totally clear, no? But for two reasons, I would not like this idea. First is, I mean, it does not need to run in the shoot, no? Because it's as a pure controller, which is just controlling and doing exposing webhooks, maybe. No? That is something that could typically live in better in the control plane. It would be closer to the API server. No? You would not suffer from any connectivity issues between shoot and control plane. Yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing is when you roll Kubernetes nodes, then we from time to time experience problems when Flux is restarting while heavily reconciling stuff. You might end up still with these stuck Helm releases, which are then in these, when Helm is putting this lock on a Helm release and then the Helm controller is crashing or being deleted, although it should not maybe nowadays any longer have issues with that. We see then that we end up in these stuck situations, and that would be, of course, better if the Flux control plane would not run on the shoot nodes at all.
Well, it would happen if then on the seed stuff restarts. So it doesn't avoid this problem, but I completely agree that seeing Flux as a part of the control plane, as a controller of the control plane makes sense as well. and it would protect the Flux controller from the shoot owner basically, and might be a way to do even more advanced stuff like this. Yeah, I agree this would be a good idea.
So maybe Vasu, I would really appreciate if you could maybe pick up such ideas, and maybe.
Yeah, message taken. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. More questions?
Anybody else from the Gardener LM team, maybe? Or I think also Andreas from the OnMetal team. I guess you use Flux as well a lot.
So maybe until people think about the next question, if they have another one, I just want to add a bit of a preview or what we are working on or had been working on so far, and how I got to know Flux pretty well in the first place is that we have an entire Gardener deployment based around Flux. So we use the Gardener Helm charts and deploy Gardener just with Flux. And at the moment, there are some manual steps in there which stopped me from showing you Gardener being installed on Gardener just with that extension. But this is our next goal, or one of our possible goals. I'm not committing on that, but in the wake of garden setup being not recommended for deployment and Landscaper not being ready, we worked on our own deployment around Gardener, which is completely based on Flux and Helm charts. And at some point in the future, we are going to open source that, or maybe working in collaboration with a few partners with us on that. And so if you imagine you had a project in your Gardener where you just click add shoot and get an entire Gardener on your own in your own project, that might be also very powerful. Of course, maybe the goal for Gardener is not to give everybody its own Gardener, but for a company like us that works with customers that want their own stuff, they want their own cloud profiles, their own isolated stuff. That is something that we think is achievable, and where we would welcome everybody to contact us and talk to us. Or once we open source it, of course, we might make another community call about that. And but if you are in the step of deploying anything with Flux that is deployable on Kubernetes, I am sure you can imagine that deploying Gardener is completely possible and might be something you are interested in as well.
Definitely, I think I would even reach out to you and like to see what your findings are in that using Flux to deploy Gardener. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, so that part is basically apart from manual steps that we didn't completely solve with just Flux, is working fine. We have many deployments working like that, but I just couldn't show it working from scratch with the extension. But we are very happy with our Flux-based Gardener deployment so far. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I think we are done for now.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for your time. Feel free to contact us in Slack or however you find us. We are happy to talk to anybody about extensions, Gardener, commercial use of Gardener, and stuff like this.